Thank you all for being here. Congratulations on being admitted to NYU. Excited to have you here. Yes, as advertised, I spent 3 years at NYU Shanghai and then wanted to get out and work in the real world, and so I went out and worked at 538 and I consult with companies. But I'm such a fan of NYU that when they asked me to come back to teach data science for everyone, I was super excited to do that. And so now I'm going to talk to all of you a little bit about what data science is, what social science is, and how both of those things put together can help us do a better job of thinking about a topic that lots and lots of people are talking about these days, which is diversity. And I mean diversity in corporations, diversity in governments, diversity in universities, all kinds. I do indeed teach a course called Data Science for Everyone. This is an introductory course to data science. It's brand new this semester. This semester it's a pilot, so we capped it at 30 students, and next semester we're starting with the cap at 150. We expect to have a lot of interest. The course is designed for students either who have some programming and/or stats experience but haven't really done data science with those skills put together or really thought about some of the philosophy of science and the causal inference behind that. We also work with a lot of applied and real data sets. I pull a lot from 538, in fact, so we look at elections, we look at governments, we look at all kinds of stuff. And it's also for students who've never once programmed in their entire lives. I will, for those students, start with the hello world on down. And by the end of the course, we're getting into predictive data science work, we're doing regression, we're doing machine learning, and that sort of thing. Now, what I wanted to talk with you guys about is diversity. And diversity is something that we are hearing about all of the time. And I get asked by companies to come in with social science and data science skills to help them figure out how to figure out diversity. And they usually want me to do it with data. And a lot of people get very excited. They're like, what can data science tell me about why we don't have more different kinds of people in our company or our government or in our positions of leadership or what? And they're all very excited. So the big questions I'm asked, what can we do to increase diversity? But what I say to them first is that you have to specify what you mean by diversity. And you have to say, what would success look like? Does diversity mean you have equal representation of all kinds of people? And by the way, what do you mean by all kinds of people? Do you mean by gender? Do you mean by race? Do you mean by educational background? Do you mean socioeconomic status? Do you mean country of origin? Or would it mean something like a representative sample relative to the population? So if the population is 12% Black or African American, you would hope to have 12% in your company. What do you mean by that? Most companies and governments and universities, including this one, have lots and lots and lots of data about who their people are, right? Either through self-reported data or maybe you filled something out when you applied. We have some information. We have information about faculty, about all kinds of things, but nobody really knows what to do with it. And that's not limited to diversity. Right now, because of wearables and having phones with us all the time, we have more data about human health, heart rates, number of steps taken, average body temperature than we've ever had before. And I spend a lot of time talking with people in the medical profession about what do I do with this? It's almost so much information that we can't actually conclude anything. So I start by saying, what is it you're trying to find out in the first place? And what is the quality of the data? So there's a lot of data out there that's horrible. And we think data is this, we talk about this a lot in my data science course, we think data is this like cold, hard truth, that because someone has assigned a number to a thing in the world, that means that's what it is. But I'm going to give you my favorite example of how data can be total crap, and we're going to talk about how you figure out whether data is valuable or not, is do you guys know on iPhones how when you walk it counts how many steps you take? So a friend of mine, when I was living in Shanghai, a friend of mine went to Myanmar and traveled by train from the south to the north of the country. And that's a very long, it's like a 14-hour, extremely slow, overnight, extremely bumpy train. And so the entire night that he was on this train, bouncing along, his phone thought he was walking. And so on that day, a few years ago, he took thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of steps. And from then on, all his averages every year, this is years ago, right? All his averages every year are like, well, you're not walking nearly as much as you used to. And if he were sending his data to some health, they'd be like, this man is so healthy, he walked across a country, miles, right? And we don't know that this data actually is right. So that's one tiny example, but there's lots and lots of examples out there that are less relevant to this particular person's health data. So, big questions in diversity. We have no idea, or we have no plan of how to address the causes of a lack of diversity in the world in a meaningful way. We've talked about it a lot, at least in the corporate world and the media, But for the most part, the numbers really haven't budged. Even the last congressional election, right? We were all very excited that representation went up in a lot of big ways on gender, on race, on a handful of LGBTQ communities, but they're still tiny compared to actual true representation. And if things continued at this rate, it would still be decades before it actually went to representation. So we don't know, okay? And we're drowning in data right now. This is the data science, the big data, we're drowning in it, but we don't have any idea of where to start to look. And I think that principles of social science can actually, and these principles, by the way, have been around for decades, if not centuries in some cases, that these ways of thinking in a principled way about the concepts that we care about will help us solve both of these things and help us make diversity more useful. So to make this very concrete, diversity, generally speaking, in a group, is some function of bias, the behavior when we interact with one another, the expectations we have about someone when they walk into a room or when they sit in a classroom or when they join your study group, assumptions you make about somebody based maybe on where they're from or what they look like, actual policies that might favor certain groups over other groups, right? Tax brackets, for example, social networks, and structural inequality. Where you're born, it turns out, has a lot to do with where you end up in life, right? So all of these are massive problems, and social science has done a pretty good job with most in a theoretical sense, but there's a lot of missing data in these areas that I think there are really exciting frontiers to do a better job of understanding. So we have a fair amount of data on some big gender, race, age kind of demographic stuff, but it pretty much stops there. We have almost no data actually in the real world on how people are behaving, how, say, students and teachers are interacting with each other, how colleagues are interacting with each other in a meeting room, and how decisions are actually being made when it comes to deciding who to promote or who to vote for. So we need lots and lots more data there. And I think that social science in particular, and why I'm excited about social science, is three ways of thinking, three lenses that are really helpful in helping us understand complex problems like this one. And diversity is just the example that I tend to be thinking about these days. This applies to all kinds of stuff. So conceptualization, when you say democracy or prosperity or wealth or happiness or diversity, what do you actually mean by that thing? How do you conceptualize that thing? Does fairness mean everyone gets one piece? Does fairness mean everyone gets one piece in proportion to how much they need? And so on. How do you conceptualize it? Social science is also a fantastic tool for thinking about complex problems because of something called operationalization. Operationalization is how are you going to measure the thing that you're looking for? So if I want to understand how wealthy is a country, or what's the wealthiest country in the world, I'd say, well, what do I mean by wealth? Do I mean how much are they producing each year? Do I mean how wealthy is the average person? Do I mean how many billionaires do they have? Do I mean how few people do they have below the poverty line? Or do I mean something else like well-being or quality of life, right? By defining what I mean by that concept, that then tells me how I'm actually going to measure that thing. And then a theory is something that helps you figure out what you should focus on in the first place. And it's a story about how data fits together. It's a story about how if I see wealth going up and I see happiness going up or I see political stability going up, a theory tells me why they might go together. And I'll break that down more in just a second. But if you're thinking of theory in the sense, the casual sense that I think we all know, which is an idea, that's close, but a social scientific theory is a little bit more specific, which is specifically how does one thing lead to or give rise to something else that I care about. So social science is using scientific methods to understand social issues. Now, I will be very honest with you. I hated the scientific method when I was young. I was in 3rd grade, and I was being forced to dissect owl pellets. Has anyone done this? Or am I just from a terrible, I'm from a rural town in Maryland, so we had, I think they were just around the school. And so have the kids do this, that will be science. And we had to do this, and I was like, this is so tedious. Why can't we just break these, they were disgusting, but I was like, why can't we just break this open and see what's in there and see what comes out, right? Well, if you have no idea what you're looking for, and I'll stop talking about owl pellets because that's disgusting, but if you have no idea what you're looking for, you don't even know where to begin to start. So for diversity, if I just dive in and I'm like, oh, we've got men and we've got women and we've got people who are transgender and we have this and I don't even know what to do with this information, right? A scientific method helps you say, what do I really want to know? How do I really think these pieces fit together? And then how do I use data to know that I'm right? And if you come to study and you study social science, which I think everybody should, you can address things in all kinds of different areas, economic areas like poverty and inequality, national level, community level, global level, right? My area is political science, and so I spend a lot of time thinking about what causes war? What can we do with data to illustrate what causes a conflict to end, right? The conflict in Syria right now is the most measured war in human history. We have more data about Syria and everything that's been going on there than we ever have about any war. And we still have no idea how to fix it, why it happened, how to stop it, apart from, kind of some narrative stories in the news, right? And so there's a lot of theoretical work that needs to be done to really take advantage of all that. We also can use social science to think about policies that we care about. What works for education, environment, health? How do I define all these things? How do I operationalize these things? Then how do I look for the right data, right? And my favorite thing about social science is that unlike the natural sciences, which think they have it tough, we have it much harder because underneath all of this stuff are people. And people, at the risk of sounding very human-centric, have all kinds of complicated goals and feelings and beliefs and values that can cause them to do things that we can't predict. An analogy I like to use in that sense is if you're studying why, and I am not a natural scientist, and this will become very obvious in this example, if you're studying why a pot of water boils, you can see that every time you turn up the temperature, it starts to boil because something's moving fast. I have no idea, right? I think about people, right? But if we were studying humans in that way, and we turn the heat up, they might boil some of the time, but they also might boil only if they're like, is everybody else boiling? Like, I don't want to boil. My friends say boiling's not cool. Like, the last time I boiled, it sucked, right? And so you're going to have this huge mess of unpredictability. And so the whole mission of social science is to try to take this rigor and apply it to humans who are inherently unpredictable. Existing methods, we do a lot of surveys in social science, interviews, text analysis, we scan, and a lot of work that I do is on the Chinese media, and I say, what is the Chinese media talking about? And I literally just count up words. Very sophisticated stuff, right? So lots and lots of traditional methods. But data science is allowing us to do more in social science than has ever been done before. And I don't think we've even scratched the surface of making use of all the promise of this, okay? So using computational and statistical methods, great. So data science is allowing us to collect data in ways we never could before. In social science, if we wanted to understand why somebody did something, we had two options. One, we could ask them, and that's okay, but the problem is a lot of people lie a lot of the time. If you ask someone a question like, are you racist? They'll probably say no, either because they don't want you to think they're racist or because they don't think they're racist, even if they might be, right? But you can be clever about it, and you can say, do you know anyone who's racist? Then we're off and running, and we're getting a little bit of information. But it's still, it's not great, and it takes a long time, and there's all kinds of biases that we can talk about, right? These days, because we can collect more data, we can do exciting things like take advantage of all the text that's being produced on social media. We can start to do some image analysis and sentiment analysis of how people are feeling when they post pictures on Instagram. Still biased, by the way, because I don't know about you guys, but I don't always post the absolute positive truth about how I'm doing on social media. I said it here first, okay? You can go read my thing and be like, none of this is true, right? There's some biases. Some of it's true. You can use computational statistical methods to analyze data in all kinds of exciting ways, and we're producing all kinds of very cool visualizations these days. And so I can talk to you more about this in Q&A if you want. In the data science course that I offer, we do a lot of talking about how you can use traditionally collected data, like survey data, to do cool things. We write web crawlers. We do natural language processing to make sense of tweets in the news and op-eds and all kinds of stuff. Machine learning and deep learning, all kinds of analyses to do sophisticated stuff with data. And visualizing, there's all kinds of cool multidimensional, three-dimensional, and mapping procedures out there. And I think that the more we're able to take all this information and put it into pictures that humans can understand in a few minutes, as opposed to matrices upon matrices of data, the further along we can get in understanding in a big way. So when people think of diversity, probably you thought of different kinds of people working together, let's say well, right? They're enjoying each other's company, they're getting something done, right? And they're in one place. We wouldn't consider a city particularly diverse if all the men were working in this building and all the women were working in another building, right? Basic. But already, as we advertised at the beginning, social science says let's be very specific about what we mean and why we mean that. So we might try to focus on race or ethnicity or gender, and then one thing I do when I work with companies who are trying to figure out how to become more diverse, or if I talk to universities who say, how do we get more diversity in STEM or something like that, right? Is to say, well, why are you focusing on these two? Is it a social justice thing? Is it a cognitive diversity story? What do you think it's about? And then you say, yeah, do we care about diversity, say, at NYU in terms of the whole student body? Do we care about diversity in STEM? Do we care about a diversity just in data science for everyone? Or whatever, what's our denominator? And then how are we gonna measure whether these diverse groups are doing anything that's any good at all, right? So a lot of excitement is going on right now where it says that cognitive diverse teams lead to better outcomes. So if you bring together a team of like 5 people from different backgrounds to solve a problem, they're more likely to come up with more creative solutions or better solutions. Okay, but how are we measuring all of those things? How do you measure how creative a solution is? That right there is a huge social science problem that we don't have an answer to. So right now, where we are is most people, if you're looking at data science numbers about diversity in the world right now, they're mostly just counting people. There's many women won Oscars, okay. Just sort of everywhere. No one's being very specific about the denominator. And no one is even thinking about what these groups are achieving. You know, what's happening, say, in Congress right now with greater diversity. Is that going to lead to more or better or more fair legislation? How would you even go about thinking about that? So social science is all about taking these multidimensional messes of problems that people argue about all the time in the news and in the media and online, and actually try to point in a certain direction and see if we can actually find something out. And here's our theory. In the simplest form that I can think of is a causal story about how data fits together. And I think without theory, you might as well not even bother with any of this. Okay, and then from theories, we have hypotheses. Great. So here's a real theory, right? A lack of racial diversity in new hires in a company is a result of the social networks of people doing the hiring. Now we're off and asking and working with a real goal, right? We know what we're looking for. We have some sense of what success would look like. A lack of women in positions of leadership is a result of ingrained assumptions about women's qualifications and expertise. Now these are assumptions. These are guesses about the world. But we can use them to inform our data science. High-performing talent leave companies when they believe a negative situation will not change. And that tells us now to look for, say, networks. And it turns out that if you actually study social networks, you can see that policies to expand recruitment for companies, for schools, for governments, can actually lead to greater diversity. So all of a sudden, you're off and running and looking at social networks and how to measure those. And there's a lot of cool social science about measuring networks. It also points to text analysis to understand why women and men are judged differently. I worked with a company that measured all of the words that were used to describe the performance of all of their employees. And we did a whole bunch of natural language processing and text analysis to find that, as we might expect from the stereotypes, a lot of men were being praised for being leaders, and women were being praised for having great attitudes and for being team players. And that's some concrete data that then the company cannot ignore. But I wouldn't have known to even look for it had I not started with the social science lens. And finally, my beloved favorite, game theory, and the exit voice and loyalty model, which I will not go into right now, but I encourage you to all look it up because it can solve every problem in your entire life. And this model tells us that a major barrier to inclusion is a lack of meaningful response by leadership when something's going wrong. Seriously, I use this to make decisions in my life. Basically, the short version is if you're in a situation that you don't like, you have 3 options. You can leave, you can use voice, which is issue a complaint or say this isn't okay, or you can shut up and live with it. So what I'm working on right now is trying to figure out how to find a mathematical model of privilege. We've all heard of the term privilege, right? It's a really important term, and it's a term that a lot of people, especially those with more privilege, do not understand. And so if I can, or we can, if you want to join me in this, actually mathematically model privilege in some way and then look for data and say, look, I've measured privilege in the world and I can point to it in a thoughtful way. Boy, would we have something concrete to talk about in changing policy. I spend a lot of time thinking about diversity as an emergent outcome, which is that most of us, most of the time, I don't feel like I'm being racist, but I am participating in a system that leads to racism. And how do inputs at the local level give rise to aggregate outcomes that people don't plan on coming, right? Just in the same way that a whole bunch of traders interacting in a market can give rise to a stock market crash, even if no one actually woke up that morning and said, I'm going to crash the market, I assume. If you are, you're a powerful person. And finally, measuring bias in real time. We have so many experiments in psychology that do a really nice job of showing that humans are super biased, right? We're biased when it comes to assessing risk, when it comes to evaluating people. We tend to gravitate towards and think more highly of people who are similar to ourselves. And we know that in the lab, we have no idea how to use data science or social science to figure that out. And there's a lot of really exciting work being done right now to try to figure that out, because then again, we could really make a difference. So without social science, we have no idea where to start looking when we come to complex problems like poverty, diversity, all these other things. We don't know what our data is capturing, and even with data, we don't even know what would work to make change. So I think you should join us. Is of interest to you. And if anyone has any questions, you can reach me here. Thank you.
All right,
I think
thank
we
you.
have, yeah.